For me, there is a little bit of hubris going on when we say we trust the technology that we are inventing more than nature, which has been around for millennia and has been proven to provide these solutions. Unfortunately, nature on the planet today is not in a good shape. We lost over half of our forests, half of our coral reefs, 3/4 of the wetlands, and 2/3 of the world's rivers have been down. So we're not being really good stewards of this planet. Fundamentally, the value that nature provides is not valued in economic terms. Investment decisions are getting distorted, and they are based as if the deterioration of nature wasn't happening. We are essentially borrowing that wealth from future generations.
Welcome to another episode of We Are Carbon. I'm Helen Fisher, and I'm joined by Diana Denke, who you've just heard highlighting the huge disconnect between the world of finance and the value of nature. For generations, wealth and financial markets have benefited from the extraction and depletion of the natural world. And we've come to a moment where many of us recognise that we simply can't afford to keep doing business as usual. Supporting and regenerating ecosystems is essential for the stability and future of our planet. And though finance can be a different world with a completely different language, it is clear that there's plenty of money out there to be moved around. So how do we bring those two factors onto the same page? Diana is passionate about nature regeneration and has a wealth of experience exploring investment opportunities into nature-based solutions. She is very generously offered to share her ability to speak both languages and bring us an overview of what can be done to bring more financing towards nature, helping all of us to get a better grasp of the barriers, the challenges and the possible paths forward. I'll link out to some of Diana's work in the description, including the Fair Carbon website, which is a company that she's co-founded to bring financing to the restoration of coastal and marine ecosystems. Don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with everything from We Are Carbon. And let's get stuck in.
So I'm Diana Denke. I'm the co-founder and chief executive of Fair Carbon, a Swiss nonprofit working to protect and restore the world's marine and coastal ecosystems. We want to see a high-integrity carbon and nature market booming and being part of the global economy. Personally, I'm really guided by a Hawaiian mindset called Malama. It means to care for, to protect and preserve. And I believe that this is the time when we need to protect and preserve the Earth as ecosystems, the living beings. And following this realization, I actually moved closer to nature. So I'm based in the Swiss Alps in a tiny mountain village. And I believe that we live in really extraordinary times where we can create a future where nature and people thrive. And the way to do that is to reconnect to nature, because we can only protect what we love.
Yeah, very well said. Very lovely to hear about yourself there and your sort of personal connection to looking after the systems and looking forward to change and believing that change can be possible. I'm really excited to learn from you on these subjects. If we could start out with nature-based solutions. It's a very sort of broad, big term, nature-based solutions, but often when we're using it, it's referring to finance or some other very significant economic value being recognised by society that we can support nature because we are valuing something that nature is putting out to us. I'd love if you could round that out and offer us an explanation of what nature-based solutions really are.
Sure. So nature-based solutions have been used as an umbrella term to capture all approaches that involve actions to protect, restore, and sustainably manage natural ecosystems, but also to do that in a way that addresses social and environmental challenges. So there's been multiple definitions by the IUCN, the European Commission, the UN, and really all of them just emphasize tools, nature-based solutions, and as tools that increase nature's resilience and biodiversity while simultaneously providing human benefits. So that's resilience against climate change, that's economic resilience, and empowerment.
Thank you. And we sort of look into this and we try to put an economic value on nature. What type of things can be considered as valued by society?
What can be considered as a value? You see, nature is really underpinning our global economies. And now there is a lot of studies that show that most of our economic activity is reliant on nature providing certain services that we just take for granted. Some of those services are regulating the climate, providing pollination services, fertilizing the soils, the diversity of living beings, so biodiversity on the planet, flood protection, storm protection, clean air. You can go on, and it's really, most of these are considered public goods. So the problem is that therefore we sort of take them granted, and we just assume that it will always be there for us.
The idea today is to really focus on how we can support those functions of nature through our economic system. How can we provide, I suppose what I'm trying to say, how can we transfer money into those systems? Because that sort of is at the heart of the way that society sort of moves and grows. How do we put finance into nature? Because it currently is very being degraded and depleted, and those services that you've described are not particularly well supported by us. So how do we flip that around? And nature-based solutions seem like a really obvious answer to how we can direct money into nature. Is that the case? And if so, why? Why are nature-based solutions a good answer to that?
Yeah, so we should definitely explore how more money can be moved into this sector. But I think before we go there, as you say, it's important to also understand why. And why is that a good solution? Why is that an obvious answer? There's a couple of things that I wanted to mention here that is important to bear in mind. So first, there is an environmental case for nature-based solutions, or NBS. The one is that it's a phenomenal climate solution. So nature-based solution can provide up to 1/3 of all the mitigation that we need by 2030 to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the IPCC found that 5 of the most effective strategies for reducing emissions are actually nature-based. So that's ecosystem protection, ecosystem restoration, and improved management of farmlands. In addition to this, they can also help us adapt to the inevitable changes that will occur as climate change intensifies, because they can protect against extreme weather events, floods, hurricanes, sea level rise, desertification, and they can be a really cost-effective solution compared to grey infrastructure. So, for example, if you want to build a dam or you want to plant a mangrove forest will achieve the same impact at a fraction of the price and also provide many other advantages. But it's also important to just not think about climate in a tunnel vision kind of way, but also consider nature or the biodiversity aspect. And unfortunately, nature on the planet today is not in a good shape. We lost over half of our forests, half of our coral reefs, 3/4 of the wetlands, and 2/3 of the world's rivers have been down. So the way we live on this planet is significantly altering land and the surface of this planet. And unfortunately, even the land that is entrusted to be under human management seems to be degrading and deteriorating. We have 2 billion hectares already degraded, and every year 12 million hectares are getting additionally degraded. So we're not being really good stewards of this planet. And nature-based solutions, especially if we could bring financing to them, could reverse this trend. But there is something else which is also important to mention, and that's the whole social case. Nature-based solutions, if they are well designed, can increase the resilience of the most vulnerable population. Because natural capital is really significant in some of the low-income countries that rely heavily on it for their GDP. And many of the world's poor, around 1 billion people, directly depend on forests for their livelihoods. So there's additionally all the indigenous peoples that depend entirely almost on the forest for survival. And so if, we must do everything to protect whatever little nature there is left on this planet, to give them a chance to also adapt to the changing climate. And then third is what you were referring to, is that there is a really, really strong economic case to be made. A functioning, healthy economy is dependent on functioning, healthy ecosystems. Luckily, we recognize this more and more, and studies have come out by the World Economic Forum to say that over half of the world's GDP is directly dependent on nature. Obviously, agriculture and food and beverages are more dependent than other sectors. But the problem is we're not taking this into account when we are making economic decisions. And what happens, and this is how it comes back to finance, is because fundamentally the value that nature provides is not valued in economic terms, investment decisions are getting distorted, and they are based as if the deterioration of nature wasn't happening. So just the cost of biodiversity loss alone could reach 4% of GDP each year by 2050 in some countries under the business as usual scenario. And we really know that it's less costly to conserve a functioning, healthy ecosystem than trying to restore it. Plus, once the degradation reaches a certain limit or a tipping point, it loses its self-regenerative properties and the ecosystem can collapse. So right now, we believe that around 30% of many countries' territory is at risk of this ecosystem collapse due to a decline in biodiversity. So if and when that happens, there's no other choice, but we have to make a large scale investment into nature to mitigate the risks. And that's why a lot of insurance companies have started to looking into this sector. But doesn't it make sense to preempt that and already protect what we have?
Thank you. It's such a big, beautiful picture that you're helping us to grasp here. The idea, in my mind, this sort of conversations around finance and money are somewhat less comfortable than just sort of talking about nature and the solutions and the wonderful sort of functions that it offers to us, because they've almost been seen as two separate things. We have the business world, we have the finance world, we have our science, then we've got the natural world, and that's a separate thing. Very little in the modern, particularly Western societies, that intertwine them two together. But to have this conversation in that very broad picture and realize it's not about putting things in segments, it's actually realizing that they're all connected. And if we just keep business as usual, it's actually a pretty horrible outlook. And that we can see that when it's not just a case of, well, it's going to happen over there or it's going to happen up there, or it's actually whatever impact that we have that causes detriment to one area of the globe is going to actually influence all of us and come back round. And I think that you touched on it there, that idea of once you reach a certain point of degradation in an ecosystem, it actually really struggles to come back, to bounce back. And we have to, as stewards and as people really very much dependent upon this planet, we have to think to the future and recognize that it's not possible to do business as usual any longer and not have outcomes that are beyond our kind of control. Why not, like you say, take the action now, preempt it, rather than wait for things to get beyond the point of repair? And the sort of conversation, I feel like it's going to be a very nuanced conversation. There are some overlaps and bringing in this sort of beautiful essence of the wondrousness of nature, and then the restrictions or the structure of our society, which is there and it's structured in this way for a reason and with benefits. But actually, how do we soften those structures to bring something new? And when we think of what you've just outlined, not just the opportunity that nature has to offer us all a value, but the necessity for us to look after it better. When we kind of bring those two things in together, it looks that nature-based solutions aren't just an obvious solution and path forward, but we have to do it. We really have to make this change. And it brings me to this question of, if we can put a value to nature and these solutions exist, why isn't money just being thrown into them? Why is the world not, we should really all just be sat back watching it regenerate, watching it thrive, because it's recognized that it has this financial underpinning to our economy also. It's not separate from us. So in that regard, why isn't that the case? What are the barriers to recognizing nature as a solution and transferring that money into it? What barriers exist that are stopping it from being scaled?
Yeah, you're right, and also, I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of the people who are overseeing significant sums of money, in terms of referring to large institutional investors, they are heavily regulated. They can only play in a certain way and take risks that they are mandated to take. So the first thing to really note here is that fundamentally, it's hard to make the economics work when nature is not valued in the current economic system. And until policies and the regulatory environment is aligned with the climate and nature goals, and the economic incentives are redirected to reflect that, the markets will not be able to efficiently price those risks and allocate resources. And so ultimately, the investment and policy decisions will be misinformed because they rely on an underpriced biodiversity risk. So, and there is a reckoning that this is happening. There is a reckoning that in the past 50 years, the human population has doubled, the global economy has grown fourfold, and this was only made possible by an extractive approach to natural capital. So there is a disconnect between our economic systems and how we think about wealth and the reality on the ground. We are essentially borrowing that wealth from future generations. And I do think there is a reckoning, even in the financial industry, about this. But how fast can they move? It's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, because they say, I have a fiduciary duty to do what is in the best interest in terms of financial metrics that I need to abide by, but what is in the best interest of those that are relying, for example, on that pension to get when the time comes. So, changing systems is hard, and it takes time, and it takes lots of things to happen simultaneously. And I do think that we're going in that direction. But if we want to zoom in a little bit into what is the particular case around nature-based solutions, especially compared to technological solutions, and what kind of characteristics they have that make private investment a little bit more difficult to access. I think we can do that. So first, nature-based initiatives have a very localized nature, and they often have a small scale or a limited scale and a lack of replication amongst those geographies. And so it's rare that they would mature into the large-scale investment of hundreds of millions of dollars that private capital is often looking for. And therefore, they are needing specialized, higher-priced, innovative capital and bespoke transactions that can enable them to happen. The second point is that you talk to investors and they say, yes, I want to put my money into nature. And you talk to the projects and they say, investors are not walking their talk. It's all about PR and marketing, but actually they don't really put investment dollars into it. And I'm actually speaking to a lot of the investors who say, well, I would love to invest, but I have to reject 90% of the proposals that come on my desk. So how can both be true? Well, I think it can be true. And what it actually means is that there is the availability of an investable project supply is not in line with the demand. So we don't get enough projects at a competitive risk return profile that the investors are looking for. And there is a number of reasons for it. On the risk side, still a lot of these nature-based solutions are classified as early stage or emerging and therefore risky, which means that investors don't necessarily feel comfortable going in there, or they are demanding extra returns to compensate for the higher risk that they are taking. And we can further dissect this risk into real risks that you can probably put a probability against and you can try and mitigate, and uncertainty. And I think the real risk is the country risk, the currency risk, the operational risk. Will the project happen? Will it fail? Are people on the ground responsible? Are they going to be able to keep this going? But there is also a lot of uncertainty that basically comes from the questions of where is this market evolving and where is the regulatory landscape evolving, which will impact whether future projects can materialize the revenues that they are projecting and whether they can sustain it over the long run. So if you add then all the fear of the negative press and the questions around integrity, you can see why a lot of investors may be like on the fence about putting, $100 here or $100 into a proven technology. And then on the return side, it's kind of like important to say that at current carbon prices, it's still limiting how many projects can be made economically viable. So the carbon prices are still too low. And then we're only talking about the carbon markets. Of course, the moment we're able to value more of those ecosystem services, such as biodiversity or the water retention or the community benefits, the more you can create a financially feasible project as well. And there's a couple of additional factors that play into it. I think that there is a timing mismatch. So investors, they are paid based on assets under management. And that means that money they have deployed. The investment needs of these projects are such that in the early stages, there is some investment needed for conservation, not very much for restoration. Of course, the upfront costs are higher, but then it takes a few years to get that project accredited and really going. And then it takes another couple of years to really wait until the revenue starts coming in. And this doesn't really align with investor timelines. Aside from infrastructure investors, they are not really geared to be in on an investment for 15, 20 year time. And then there is also two more aspects I wanted to mention. One is that investors need evidence, tangible historical data on performance. That's how they can evaluate the due diligence. And that is often lacking with nature-based solutions, because a lot of the conservation NGOs that have been working in this field for many decades rely on anecdotal evidence. That's just, it wasn't in their nature to really try and collect that kind of data. I think this is changing. There is a lot of companies that are focused on providing tech-enabled monitoring and MRV solutions. And so we will see this change. But of course, it takes time to build the evidence case and to really be able to figure what kind of interventions work and which are the ones that are not as effective. And then last is a minor point at this point, but I think it's still important, is that there is a shortage of human capital and a financial acumen to deliver nature-based solution projects at scale. So, which limits the capacity of the sector as a whole to undertake large-scale implementation. And again, nature restoration champions are not going to be the same guys that are going to prepare a perfect P&L Excel sheet that investors want to see, and that's kind of understandable. So you see more and more intermediaries coming into this space who say, we will help you create the financing structure, we will help you do the marketing, we are able to pitch your project to an investor because we are speaking their language.
Thank you. That's so clearly said. All of that broke it down so wonderfully, bridging these kind of two worlds, if you like, because it's complicated stuff. And I think that last point you made is very relevant, that the people who are on the ground able to put these solutions into action don't have the language that ties together with the large scale investment and the people that are in that world of moving money. Thank you very much. I think your first point, I'm just going to oversimplify, but the idea that really risk is so significantly weighed up by, well, it's been done before, it's been proven, and we're going to stick by what we know. Yeah. And change is just, whether that's nature or something completely novel, technologically wise, it's always going to be more difficult to get money into something that's completely new. Hopefully over time, this as a solution becomes less and less new and more understood and recognised. I think that your point about valuing nature and actually it being undervalued at this time because this sort of the weighting is going on carbon instead of looking at the full picture. And if you looked at that holistic view of the impacts on water and biodiversity and even the human, the social, the community aspect, that all as one big value probably is significantly more than what is prepared to be put into the figure of carbon. Yes. Which of course is in itself more difficult in a nature-based situation to probably monitor and put a figure to. But that brings me to the technologies that do exist that can sort of sit alongside that. We do know that there's money available. We hear of very large sums of money being invested in very big infrastructure projects that are looking at that carbon capture. So that one aspect, ticking that one box that nature can provide, capturing carbon, but through a technological solution. Could you help us to understand these a little bit more, to sort of look at that side-by-side comparison, and starting with what they are and why they are something that is being invested into?
Yeah, so look, carbon removal can take different forms, like the natural solutions like growing trees and the ability of the soil to sequester carbon. They have been around for millennia. I think in terms of technology, it has proven that it works. The challenge is measuring how much is being sequestered accurately, which is easier to do on an individual kind of tree basis. But once you start to extrapolate that into ecosystems, and especially if you're getting into some of the marine and coastal ecosystems where you are dealing with above ground and below ground biomass, it becomes increasingly technologically or technically complex. So, but there are technology-based solutions, carbon removal processes such as direct air capture or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and mineralization. And they claim to have the potential to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at a large scale. They are currently not able to do it. So these are emerging technologies that are at various stages of development and commercial readiness. So they are popular for a reason, and they do have some advantages over nature-based solutions. The first argument is that the carbon can be trapped in the forest for centuries, but a wildfire comes, it can be released back to the atmosphere within minutes. So the permanence is an issue that cannot be guaranteed. However, once we capture carbon from the atmosphere via direct air capture, it can be stored for the long term in geological formations. So this and the fact that it's easier to determine the exact amount that you've taken out because it's such a controlled environment, I think is something that makes them really popular. I do want to say, though, that this technology also has its challenges. There is pros and cons to everything. And namely that currently those technologies are very, very expensive. So it costs hundreds of dollars to remove a single ton of CO2. The direct air capture goes between $250 and $600 today, depending on the technology. And if you compare this to reforestation, which costs around $50 or less than a ton, you can see how the same money invested there versus here doesn't even get you the same impact. They are also very small in scale. So there's 18 plants of varying sizes that currently exist. And if you add up all their capacity, they are capturing around 8,000 tons of CO2 per year. That is tiny. That is the size of an average sized reforestation project, and the largest projects are many, many times larger than that. So here you're talking about, a couple of tens of thousands of hectares. We have millions of hectares to protect and restore. And yet many of those nature-based projects actually struggle to raise the funds to do that. So as it stands, these technologies do very little and cost a lot. The argument is that they won't reach the scale necessary in time to remove the amount of carbon to avoid the worst impact of climate crisis. And then there is also the risk that is associated with some of these technologies. It's not enough to capture that carbon from the atmosphere. You need to also safely transport it to the point where it will be stored in geological formations for permanence. And the most common method for transporting them today is through pipelines. But, what can happen to pipelines, as we have seen in the fossil fuel industry, they can break, there can be leakage, there can be accidents. And the moment you release that concentrated CO2 into the atmosphere, it actually tends to stay close to the ground and it causes danger to human health. People can suffocate from breathing it in. So it can be quite hazardous to human populations living nearby. And then the last point is that the energy used, they require an enormous amount of energy, some of these plants to run. Some use renewable energy resources, but others don't. So you are solving one solution and creating some others. But I think this is necessary. Now, why are they so popular with investors? And I think the answer there is that they're just much better suited to the current investing environment. So basically, for pilot projects and demonstrations, there's a lot of venture capital that flows into this space. Why? Because you have the high risk. You don't know if the technology is going to work or, at what pace, but they're willing to make that high risk investment because the returns could be enormous. And that's not something that you can say for nature-based solutions, at least not until we change our economic system. And then there's a lot of corporate investments. They like to lock in credits, carbon credits that are through technological solutions, because it seems secure in a sense that as long as the plant keeps functioning and operating, they are guaranteed to get those credits. While as with the nature-based solutions, you still rely on nature and people, which are two of the most unpredictable forces of the universe. So anything can go wrong, and then you don't have your credits. But I also think it speaks a little bit to our fundamental beliefs. What do we trust? And for me, there is a little bit of hubris going on when we say we trust the technology that we are inventing more than nature, which has been around for millennia and has been proven to provide these solutions. So, yeah, I also think that the type of investment needed by these projects are better suited to that kind of venture capital, private equity, corporate finance type of investments, because even just to have a small facility, which is a pilot facility, they often need tens of millions of dollars. But once you are talking about commercial scale facilities, you're actually looking at 100 million to a billion ticket sizes. And that's where real money can be made, or, big money can be made. So you have a lot of interest on a pure commercial basis that flocks to here. But if I wanted to compare them, I think it's important to look at scalability and readiness. So tech-based solutions have a massive scalability, but they are very far from being ready, and there's a lot of risks that need to be mitigated. Capital accessibility. Of course, the high growth potential attracts more commercial investors, including venture capital and private equity, while as nature-based solutions rely more on carbon finance today, or some form of blended finance, impact investments, philanthropy. And the risk and return profile, which also differs. Nature-based solutions bring you the immediate benefits and lower risk, but also less of a financial return in the long run. So if you ask me what is the solution, I think I'm reluctant to say this, but I think we will need both, because unfortunately we're still not able to turn that emissions curve around, and the slower we are able to reduce emissions, the more we need to rely on carbon removal. And that means that you will need both nature-based solutions and technological solutions. But that is if you're looking through the lens of climate change mitigation and carbon. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I think we shouldn't fall into a carbon tunnel vision, because climate change and biodiversity loss are not two crises. They are interdependent, and they need to be addressed together. They have the same shared drivers of human activity. The more climate change is happening, it further exacerbates biodiversity loss and diminishes the ability of those ecosystems to function as carbon sinks. So unless you're stepping in and kind of like stopping that soon enough, you are just going to make both crises worse. And we know that these ecosystems are needed for climate regulation as well. So my take is that if we want to safeguard nature and ensure a stable climate for future generations, it's crucial to address these crises together. And it's only nature-based solutions that offer a solution to both.
I'm really, really grateful for your sort of depth of consideration on this, because it's such a big, intertwined topic. And you are giving figures that are quite alarming in a lot of ways, not in sort of the detriment side of things, but just that the money is there. Yeah. The risk is there to be prepared to take. But actually, I'm only prepared to take that risk with my money if there's a big promise of reward. If I can take that big gamble of massive reward on a personal level. However, if you give me a solution that I, put my money into it, it's more likely to have a bigger outcome in terms of the carbon that is captured, because the figures that you gave on what is being captured with the technology is it's scratching. It's like a little tiny scratch on the surface. So yes, there's a lot of it just seems a little bit farcical. Like we have a system of this massive amounts of money prepared to be moved, but no value to what is really making the difference. And I suppose a lot of that's education. And I imagine within this, there are people that are thinking, well, I would like to invest and I'd like it to have that balance. So in terms of people that do invest in the nature-based solutions and the type of financing, the differences in the sort of high risk but big reward versus the type of financing that goes into nature-based solutions, how do they differ? What can we understand about the financing options that are available?
Yeah, and look, I just also want to say that I'm fully acknowledging that argument which says we know we will need technological solutions, so we should invest today, so there is time for them to scale, the cost to come down, and for them to be able to do much more. And I'm not arguing against it. What I'm saying is that meanwhile, we figure out a solution that may work in a couple of decades, we allow the destruction of nature to continue to happen, which will exacerbate the climate crisis. And by the time we have all these plants ready to suck out carbon from the atmosphere, we destroyed all the wildlife and all nature and all the wonderful forests and ecosystems. So I really want to see a world in which both can happen simultaneously, because nature needs investment today. And what is hard for me to see is that imbalance, like how much money is being flown to these technological solutions, and seemingly how easily, compared to how hard times some of the incredible conservation projects have to just raise 20-30 million. There is something wrong there if we're not able to realize that the stake that is that's at stake here. So, so there is a couple of things that can still be done, and I think are still happening in terms of innovative approaches to that try to bring more money into nature-based solutions. In the near term, I think that there needs to be de-risking mechanisms that help the growth of a nascent market. So I talked about that early stage being perceived as too high risk for the kind of return that it gives. Nature-based solutions, just like any other business, they go through a serious transformation across various stages of their development. So early on, you don't know much about the type of project that you want to create and what is the really potential for revenues, and everything is up in the air. It's just like a typical startup. But once they start to kind of like create those pilot studies, understand where the project boundaries are, create a carbon baseline assessment, do their biodiversity baselines, engage with the local communities, figure out what the policy landscape is, there is more and more areas which are no longer uncertain, or where you can base like an informed estimation around where you're going. And so the risk profile of those projects as they grow are diminishing. And I think what needs to happen is that at each distinct stage, we find the right blend of financing instruments that respond to the needs of the project, and the right terms, the right kind of investors with the risk appetite. And if we're able to build that capital continuum as these projects mature and at every stage give them the type of financing that they need, then you will see commercially viable and scalable solutions. So today, it's like investors, even those willing to invest, are like standing there at that line and say, I want my investable projects. But it's not just going to happen like that. You need to nurture, you need to cultivate them. And right now, what happens is a lot of these projects get a little bit of funding to get going, and then they fall into this valley of death between the stages of incubation and initial scale up, where they just cannot get follow-on funding. And it was a really similar story for renewable energy a couple of decades ago when it was deemed uninvestable. And it did receive a lot of subsidies and government support and blended finance to get to the stage where it is today. So, I think that needs to be figured. And that also we need to provide better traceability and credible data on the actual impact that is achieved. And this goes hand in hand with improving the integrity of the carbon markets as a whole, or ensuring that the new biodiversity credit markets, if they take off, have that integrity built in from the get-go. And there is a lot of initiatives around this, the ICVCM, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. There's a lot of movement that wants to create that tangible data on which investors can base their decisions. And then I think in the medium term, there needs to be some form of aggregation of demand so that you can aggregate multiple small-scale projects and offer a portfolio of investments, because that's when you can tap into the larger ticket sizes, which will be interesting for investors when you're not looking to raise 1 to 5 million, but you can say invest in this portfolio when it's 50 million, it's 100 million. You are talking to different type of investors at that time. And then, as I mentioned, we need to increase the local capacity and financial expertise, support local entrepreneurship of nature champions, and we have to have certain market mechanisms that increase and solve for the mismatch of tenure expectations and increase the liquidity of these markets. Because the problem is you can have investors with higher risk appetite who come in and say, okay, I'm going to develop that early stage project, much like a VC, but then I want to have an exit. I want to be able to sell the project at a premium, which is fair, but it only really works if there is better liquidity around the carbon markets. And then, of course, long term, you won't be surprised that I'm saying this, but we need to correct the systemic economic failures through regulation.
Yeah, there's a lot of things there, and I think it actually gives us this bit of hope, because we've talked about the very sort of solid, unsupportive structure of this financing system as it comes sort of hand in hand with these nature-based solutions. But there are ways around it. There are potential paths forward, and something that comes to mind, and I think it is actually fairly well covered in what you've spoken just now. The idea of bottom-up transformation in regenerative transformation of landscapes. It's more about principles than really having a defined set of rules to follow. And one of those often, really seems to come down to localization and smaller scale, that passion of community or individual driving things forward. It's the kind of comes together in a way that just feels like it's always going to be more resilient and efficient than a big corporation and a huge scale can. Additional to that, you touched on educating. That's kind of like bringing a new language and a new set of skills to people that are working at that on the land scale. And I think that those two things hand in hand feel very powerful to me. Do you see that as a way forward to push forward with that, and to how would that be acted upon?
Well, absolutely. I have seen many beautiful projects, even in regenerative agriculture, where a group of farmers come together and they create their own produce and they create their own market access by selling it directly to customers, and it's branded beautifully, and it says this is from regenerative agriculture. So you do have opportunities like that, and I think we will continue to see more and more as people becoming aware of the need to transform the way we produce food, for example, or the way we manage land. But it becomes a sort of a barrier when you need external financing, because it's much more difficult to get financing for small-scale projects. Investors prefer large-scale restoration projects because they, again, offer a higher return on the time that they invest in the due diligence. It's costly for them to evaluate whether they want to put money into this or not. And, if the return is small, it's not worth even going through that process. So that's important to remember. But it's also important to remember that the reality is that land ownership around the world is extremely fragmented. So there is only so many large-scale restoration projects that you can do before you run out of options. And if we are serious about wanting to restore this planet, we need to figure a way in which hundreds of millions of small-scale projects can exist. Today, at least I've been looking into what is the minimum viable size for mangrove restoration, and we've come to understand it's about 1,000 hectares, under which it's not even worth trying to get through one of the ICRA accredited standards on the voluntary carbon markets, because it's too small. So this leads a lot of potential areas being excluded from the system. And there are new solutions, mainly technology-based platforms and blockchain and kind of distributed ledgers, in how you can overcome this and create decentralized networks where both the financing and the verification can happen at a much lower cost. And I'm fairly hopeful that these systems will scale. And I also personally think that, the next unicorn will be a company that figures how to do this. But we need to bear in mind that nature-based solutions will never be your cookie-cutter approach, where you have done something really successfully in one location, you can just copy-paste it into another, because you're always dealing with local jurisdictions, local laws and regulations, cultures, habits, people. So it has to be, we have to be solving for that, for integrity in science, for human resources and knowledge, and the financing and the policy, all at the same time.
Yes, it's a big web, but I think that there's such a valuable amount of information, and you've introduced us to so many concepts in a really accessible way, and I'm very, very grateful for that. Before we wrap up, I'd love to hear about the work that you're doing with Fair Carbon, because this is something that I think demonstrates and is sort of, acting upon a lot of what you spoke about today. It would be lovely if you could introduce that work to us.
Sure, very happy to. So basically what we do echoes a lot of these challenges that I listed that we're trying to solve for. We exist to protect coastal and marine ecosystems, which are essential in reaching climate and biodiversity targets. These ecosystems, such as mangrove forests, salt marshes, seagrass meadows, they are real climate and nature champions. A lot of people don't know this, but actually wetlands occupy less than 5% of the global land area, but blue carbon ecosystems are responsible for about half of the total carbon that is buried in ocean sediments yearly. So their potential for climate mitigation is massive. They're also critical for biodiversity. They are actually providing a lot of food and refuge and nursery habitat for many of the mammals, reptiles, birds, and fish that are driving global fisheries worldwide. They're also amazing in terms of storm protection, protecting coastlines against damage and change and floodwaters. So how come they have all these incredible properties and we're still losing them? They're still in decline. We lost 30 to 50% of the mangroves. So what we want to do with Fair Carbon is to say, okay, how can we stop and just envision a really different world? Envision a world where local communities can benefit from protecting and restoring natural habitats, where they are rewarded fairly for what they do, and how can we utilize carbon and nature markets that enable them to do so. So what we did is we looked at what keeps the blue carbon market small. Why don't we see hundreds of projects around the world? And what we came to understand is that there are distinct technical, finance, and policy barriers, as you would imagine. Technically, it's quite complex. It's more complex to develop a blue carbon project than a terrestrial forest. In terms of finance, I think we discovered what's the issue there. Blue carbon is the same. And then in terms of policy, there is a lot of legal and political aspects of blue carbon that can be challenging. And sometimes these ecosystems fall under multiple jurisdictions. Sometimes those areas are not well regulated. The regulations are currently changing. Countries are discovering how to respond to Article 6 negotiations. So this is all just a lot of information to deal with that an investor or an individual project may find really, really hard to navigate. So what we do is we try to think of ourselves as like market builders. We facilitate solutions into each of these barriers. So for the technical barriers, we created a Blue Carbon Academy, which is an actionable science-based education for both projects and investors that gives them access to knowledge on how they can get into the blue carbon market. It saves them time and money by helping them understand what it takes to get a quality project off the ground. In terms of the financing, we're launching an accelerator which will provide projects with capacity building and early stage financing, the tricky one that we talked about. And the idea is that projects can follow a year-long journey in a structured cohort-based format. And on successful graduation, they are actually getting guaranteed follow-on funding so that we don't let them fall into this valley of death between the different stages. And then finally, we do a lot of policy research on enabling conditions, which assesses how ready a country is for blue carbon investment. And we hope that this informs both projects and investors and guides them in the decision to start a new project somewhere.
That sounds amazing. Thank you so much. And it would be wonderful to have you back if you have the availability at some point in the future to talk to us more about blue carbon, because I think it's a topic that would be wonderful to dive in with you. But yeah, this subject of finance, you've helped us to navigate it, and I really very much appreciate that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Helen, for having me.
And thank you for listening to this episode of We Are Carbon. You can learn more from Diana by taking a look at the links in the description. Don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with everything here from We Are Carbon. And let's keep figuring this all out together.